Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. This is our Valentine's Day special, and I don't know if we're treating that, giving it the credibility it deserves by talking about Lizzie Borden, but today we're going to be talking about Lizzie Borden. I'm here with Sue Cato, and we have the delightful opportunity to speak with Cara Robertson. Sue, why don't you
I'll
introduce
tell
Cara?
you a little bit about Cara because I first met her about 3 decades ago when we were both studying in Oxford, and Cara was so kind and welcoming to my fellow students and I. And Cara has been following the Lizzie Borden case since she was an undergraduate at Harvard. She went on to Oxford University, and she earned also, in addition to her PhD there, a JD from Stanford Law School. She's clerked at the Supreme Court of the United States and served as a legal advisor to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague. So her legal knowledge is impeccable, and she's put it all together in her book, The Trial of Lizzie Borden, which really draws on incredible quantities of research to create the most comprehensive account of the trial of Lizzie Borden. So whatever you thought you knew, whether it's just the nursery rhyme or the TV shows, you're going to learn so much more about this. So welcome, Cara. And I mean, I'll just start by saying, tell me about this lifelong or like 30-year interest in Lizzie Borden for you.
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's really a treat to be here. Yeah, Lizzie Borden, the story is just one that just didn't let me go. I thought that I was done with it after college, and as you know, I moved on to 18th century literature, which I still love. But I guess it was partly being back in the law world, or I guess it was being back in the law world that made me think about the case from a different perspective. And then I just found every time I thought I was done, I picked it up again. So I thought, all right, I'll just write a book about the trial of Lizzie Borden.
Well, tell me how you've ended up with all these news sources. Like, you had access to lawyers' journals, unpublished local reports, and even Lizzie Borden's letters. Was this all stuff that just, like, how did you come across all this?
Yeah, it's actually a good argument in favor of taking a really long time to do something, because sometimes material comes to light. And in this case, the timing was right for a whole lot of slightly hoarding Yankees to clean out their attics. Nice. And they were the ones who had the material. Mm-hmm. And so as a result of coming back to it when I did, I was able to, as you point out, get access to some papers that weren't available before. And I think it gives a richness to this story. That the transcript is quite extensive. It was an unusually long trial, and it was a public trial. So there's terrific newspaper coverage, which is really interesting and gives you a flavor. But speaking as a lawyer, there's nothing like having some of the backstage or the background information of what the lawyer's strategies were. Did they really run down this lead? Did they not? How seriously did they take this evidence? Were they worried? Were they not worried? So I think all of that just gives, it just makes it more vivid. Right. You can sort of see it. It's not just a historical artifact of this thing that happened a long time ago, but you can see real people grappling with these issues in real time.
And I love the way you structured it. Really encourages that, because you've got a day-to-day account of this inquest and this trial. So you can see that almost breaking news as it happens with the newspaper coverage. Now, one of the things that really stood out to me was nothing has changed. The coverage of this trial in the media was literally like something I felt like we would see today with the Daily Mail. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what stood out to you about the coverage of the Lizzie Borden case?
Well, we think of these things as being in the past being sort of quaint or sedate or affairs, and in fact, it was just this kind of circus of the kind that we'd see today. I mean, in America, probably the closest parallel is O.J. Simpson, but right. O.J. Simpson sort of set the standard for subsequent big trials. And you had the equivalent of Camp OJ there. Every major columnist from New England and beyond was at the trial, plus all the local reporters were sending wires. I mean, in fact, there was a special shed outfitted with for wire services. And you get a sense that everybody involved in the case is a character in these in human interest stories or color commentary that the journalists do. They're not just reporting on what actually happens with the lawyers, but also just who's in the audience, how do they react to things. And then they make recurring characters out of court officials as well. Sometimes they're comic characters, sometimes they're, taken very seriously. Right. So I think that there's an immediacy for the public that you wouldn't expect, in an era before TV. That people really feel like they're actually there and following along.
The journalistic, as a lifelong journalist, I find the journalistic analysis, just fascinating. And the analogy to OJ is really fascinating. OJ was a celebrity before the trial. What was it about Lizzie Borden that captivated people's imaginations?
Yeah, I think it's the combination of how ordinary she was and the brutality of the crime. And the specific facts of the crime, in that it involved the murder of a father and a stepmother. The stepmother was definitely the afterthought, although she's presented as the reasons for the murder. Pretty much everybody thinks that, on the prosecution side, that Abby Borden, Mrs. Borden, was the intended victim. I think that, had it been a poisoning case, for example, I think it still would have been shocking. Because it was a daughter killing a father or killing parents. Had it been a man who was accused of killing his father and stepmother, that also would have been shocking, but not in the same way. It was just, it brought every horrible fear together. And it seemed, I think, in the way that these trials that endure do, it seems to tell you something about that moment in a way that gives you, it gives you access to, what are the greatest anxieties of that time and preoccupations. So here you have a woman who ticks all the boxes of proper upper middle class womanhood, and she's active in her church, and she sort of presents as normal. And you have this crime of extraordinary brutality that they would have expected to see as the murderer, some sort of insane immigrant.
Looking at it which is so fascinating, looking at it with our current eyes, what would we have seen? What would we see differently in terms of the fact that she was a woman, she was single, the descriptions of her as a maid, as being ordinary? What's the sexism involved here that maybe would certainly not have been interpreted at the time?
Yeah, there are a fair amount of assumptions baked into the trial, right? And I think probably the most striking one is just that despite the fact that all the medical experts say that a woman of ordinary strength could have committed the murders, the defense just says it wouldn't be possible for someone like her to have committed the murders. It's just physically and morally impossible. And I don't think we have that sense anymore. Not that, yay, women can do terrible things too, but just that there's something about this particular type of woman that makes that impossible. I don't think we'd see anymore. One of the things that I thought was most striking too, in terms of the way that the evidence is presented, is, without getting deeply into the weeds, one of the big points in Lizzie Borden's favor is that no one ever sees any blood on her after the murders. And we know that the police immediately found a pail of bloody cloths in the basement. Needless to say, the police officer asked Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden referred the officer to her doctor, and her doctor said, it's okay, they're menstrual cloths, basically. We don't need to look any further. And you have the prosecution and the defense just not wanting to talk about it.
Right.
And it's like many things in the case, it could work both ways, right? It is an explanation for how she could have cleaned herself up and then hidden the evidence of that. But it's also, it also could be a sign of menstrual insanity. I mean, that was a theory at the time, that would explain ordinary women doing terrible things out of character. But they just, it's pretty good evidence for the prosecution. And they're just like, no, we won't talk about it.
That's so shocking.
Oh my.
The idea, like literally the bloody cloths are right there. Oh, but we can't talk about it because it might be period blood. I can't even.
Right. She burned a dress after the I'm sorry, I don't mean to make light of this.
No, but
she burned
we're
a
all
dress
burning our dresses all the time. I'm tired of this outfit. I'm burning.
And there's some suspicion that it might have been the dress she was wearing on the morning of the murders. There's you could write an entire book, which I will not, on the subject of blue dresses in this case. But anyway, so blue dress was turned in, and the prosecution always suspected that it wasn't the same blue dress. And we know she burnt a dress, and the point that she made was, it was this thing stained with paint, and her sister basically took the responsibility by testifying at trial that it was her idea to burn the dress, and so it didn't really mean anything, that it was just this old paint stained dress. And there's evidence that it was in fact paint stained. But so the prosecution goes after that, that the blood would have been on that. But they did have in the basement actual blood.
And the inquest, of course. Okay, so at first they obviously found enough evidence to say she's got to go to trial, and the popular opinion seemed to be guilty. And then not only is she found not guilty, but I found, like you quote the New York Times after the verdict, calling her the most unfortunate and cruelly persecuted, and saying there was never any serious reason to suppose that she was guilty. Why the dramatic turnaround? Was it just an amazing effort on the part of Lizzie Borden's lawyers? Was it the press? What do you think accounts for this?
Yeah, it's such an interesting development. I think it's both of the things that you mentioned. In other words, the press account gets more and more sympathetic as the trial goes on. I think they arrive with some skepticism. I mean, even though they think it's unlikely, but they're. I think seeing somebody like Lizzie Borden in the courtroom every day, it's just hard to get away from one's preconceptions about who is capable of something like that. I think, on some level, we might feel the same way. I mean, even though, we know that's not true, but just to be in the courtroom and see someone on trial for their life, and she looks just like everybody else in the audience, right? She's not just exhibiting any signs of, some sort of derangement. The other thing is that the defense managed to get the two most damning pieces of evidence against Lizzie Borden excluded. And I think from then on, even though, of course, people outside the trial, would have known about those pieces of evidence, that the newspapers were happy to take that as proof that it wasn't really evidence, if you see the distinction, right? So then at that point, it's much easier to say that, she couldn't possibly have done it. And one of the two pieces of evidence, I mean, just to quickly say, are her testimony at the inquest, which is the only time she spoke under oath. And she gave a kind of rambling and contradictory account of her movements on the morning of the murders. But secondly, someone identified her as a woman who tried to buy poison the day before the murders. Unsuccessfully. So there's no question that the murders were committed, with a hatchet. But had they been able to get that admitted, then it would have really punctured the defense presentation of Lizzie Borden as just somebody who's in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
And of course, poison is a woman's weapon. And, it would be a lot easier for a jury to imagine that, well, out of desperation, when she couldn't get the poison, she turned to an implement that was in the home already.
Right.
I mean, tell us about the letters, because Lizzie Borden has become obviously, a character in our imagination, for better or for worse, and with her own prejudices. And I mean, I'm fascinated to what you say that there's one testimony, but what was her? What do we know about her mindset, about her belief system, about her capabilities?
Yeah, the letters are fascinating, but give you less of a sense of her inner world than one might hope. Um, I've always felt she was a bit of a cipher, and in fact, the newspapers referred to her as a human sphinx, and they meant that in a way that was derogatory, like that she had too much self-possession to be who she really seemed to be. Those sympathetic reporters obviously talked about that as a sign of American grit and Yankee ladyhood and et cetera. But the letters give you a good sense of what were her conditions like in jail, right? Which were not typical. She was allowed to have visitors. She received presents. She had a place to do, sewing. She had a pet cat. Basically, the jailhouse cat became her pet cat, and she was given special food and all that. But you do have the sense too that she feels pretty bleak about her chances. It's easy in retrospect, particularly looking at it from the, sort of gender lens or a class gender lens, to say that really they were never going to convict her. But I don't think that was the sentiment among the, Borden faithful. I think they were really worried. And so too were her defense team until those items of evidence were excluded, that they felt like it could have gone either way.
Right.
I'm not sure that's the case, but I think that that's what they really believe.
Now, you comment at one point that every generation writing about Lizzie Borden, or everyone writing about Lizzie Borden, it tells us more about the writer and their society's preoccupations. Where did you come down on this? You don't do a lot of weighing in and saying, I know what happened, but did you want to?
Well, I actually, as I had read all the secondary works, many of which are terrific.
Yeah.
But they pretty much always have a firm sense of guilt or innocence, and they have a theory. And I think it's difficult to get to the end of those books without feeling like someone's really been putting a thumb on the scale one way or the other. Mm-hmm. And so my goal, particularly given that I wanted it to be based on primary sources, was to just present the evidence or the information as the people at the time would have known it, because that changes over the course of the investigation and the trial, and then let people come to their own conclusion.
Having said that, do you meet a lot of people who think Lizzie Borden is innocent?
Occasionally I do, but they're usually conspiracy theorists,
right?
So they have I think that's more, I think that would be the thing of this time.
Right.
That, when they think it's innocent. Yeah. I mean, most people think she's guilty, but then there are various levels of valorization of that, right? There are people who see her as a kind of, if not a specifically heroic figure, a sort of a dark, a dark, I don't know what, mentor or something like that. Someone who was trapped and did what she needed to do to get out of the situation she was in. And I don't know, it strikes me as interesting because it still overlooks what's the obvious motive is financial independence.
Yeah.
And that's just something that no one seems prepared to discuss at the time as a possibility. I mean, obviously it has to be more than that. I mean, there's, the suffocating tension in the household, the resentment, who knows whether there was something about to happen, like Andrew Borden was about to make a will or something, that there was some precipitating thing. But, ultimately it does seem, especially based on Lizzie Borden's subsequent behavior, that she really just wanted to live in a certain way. That, her ambition was a house on the hill, which is the elite residential district of Fall River, and a little travel and having more servants and dogs galore. And that's what she wanted. And she was quite happy to, to buy the McMansion and live that way the rest of her life, even though she lived in the place where she was always going to be notorious.
You would think
it's like her ambitions didn't extend beyond that. Right. I mean, that's what strikes me.
And she did die very wealthy. I mean,
yeah. I mean, they weren't, they actually really weren't, neither she nor her sister were, big spenders. And they did, even when they bought the McMansion, they kept the old house that their parents were murdered in, as a rental property. So they definitely inherited their father's business savvy.
Right.
He was
right.
known to be a bit of a miser, which provided a motive, perhaps. Yeah.
Can you imagine who would want to live in the house where? who wants to live there? Or maybe
it's quite a tourist attraction now, though. People will go and.
I'm sure now,
but the murder house is a bed and breakfast. And the other house, I think, is available for tours. I'm not sure. There's some zoning issue. The Fall River, the present day Fall River story is a wild one. But I prefer to deal with people who are long dead.
Well, I saw an interesting on the website about your book, trialoflizzieborden.com. I saw someone's comment. People can sort of weigh in. Someone said, "Well, I stayed in the house, and now I firmly believe she was guilty." And someone's like, "Why did the house affect that?" And they said, "Because there's no halls. There would be nowhere to hide. It's not like what we think of as someone loitering in a hall. It's just like room." And
right. It's a converted tenement house. It was a 2-family house. And so, you have to walk through the rooms to get to the back. And so it would be very difficult for someone to have hidden for the hour and a half between the murders. That's probably like the most damning piece of the timing is the most damning piece of evidence in terms of who had the opportunity to commit the murders. Also, you find that there's something about the case that turns people into these amateur detectives.
Right.
So people who stay in the house, they'll fall down on the floor upstairs and then call down to ask if they're, the person that they're with could hear them, because that comes up at the trial.
That's hilarious. I not that I want to give a lot of oxygen to this, but when you say it's representative of our times, how we view these trials, and you touched on the conspiracy theorists. Because I do think we live in really an era of conspiracy theory. So how does that change Lizzie Borden's story with the current lens of this conspiracy theory? Like, how do we see it now? How does the vast public see it now?
Right. Well, I think most people just assume she was guilty, and actually the surprise is that she was acquitted and that she went on to live, a full life. Even though the town, exacted its own kind of punishment through ostracism. But I think it makes it easier for people to believe that there might have been, one of the theories is that there's this conspiracy of elders who wanted to somehow, it doesn't make sense. I should just say that Andrew Borden had an illegitimate son, and he is the one who actually committed the murders, and somehow that would be worse if that came to light than Lizzie Borden, which just historically is wrong.
Right.
Not just, it's factually wrong. There's no evidence that he had an illegitimate son, but just there's no way that it would be less upsetting to have a daughter accused of axing or hatcheting her father and stepmother to death versus an illegitimate son. So I don't think it holds water, but
I don't think so either. But it is fascinating that that all these years later we're still trying to interpret what happened. And
you've been obviously in your work in The Hague and with the U.S. Supreme Court exposed to just obviously a ton of probably some of the most interesting legal cases around. Are there others that pique your interest? Would you ever write another account like this one?
I think this is, I think if I found something that was, had a similarly interesting cultural significance, plus the transcript with really, the lawyers were excellent, so that helps. And then obviously all the press coverage. So you need the kind of combination of all of those things to make it worthwhile. And there's certainly plenty of other legal cases that are illustrative of their moment in a way that, should be explored. We're seen one way at the time and seen very differently, 10 years later, 20 years later. You don't even need the 125 years of distance.
So true. Yeah.
But how many years would you say you spent looking at, researching this story?
Oh my God. Well, it depends how you count, right?
Yeah.
You could say, right, since forever.
Yeah.
But I'd say, 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. That's amazing.
More seriously, in terms of regular visits to the archives and all that. I was doing a few other things in the interim, but I always had in mind that I was going to complete this. And as I said at the outset of this, things just kept coming up. Suddenly the lawyer's diary is available. And,
right. That's crazy.
And it did make it difficult to let go. I mean, at some point you do have to just let it go. But I was like, what's going to come out of the attic next?
Right.
They're cleaning out some summer house somewhere, somebody who's a great, grandson of somebody. Mm-hmm. And you wonder.
It's exciting. Well, I'm sure that
so it won't be the last book.
People will still be talking about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Making their theories or turning it into another movie of the week or another YA novel. Well, I know it appears in all of these, right?
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that's interesting about these fictionalizations of it, particularly when they're on TV or the movies, is that there's just it's lacking a romance, and that seems to really upset the the creators of these alternate versions, and so they pretty much always have to either add a romance or really pile on the motivations in a way that just aren't accurate. I mean, it's as if we still find her motive too upsetting on its own to power a story. Like, it wouldn't work for a genre because it's a genre piece, because it's just too much.
If only you could find out that Lizzie's father wasn't letting her marry the man of her choice.
Right, exactly. Or, right. I don't know if you saw there was a Chloe Sevigny Lizzie with Kristen Stewart.
Oh, so like a lesbian relationship.
Which I mean is very clever, because then because there's not a lot of evidence of gentleman callers at the Borden house. So,
right.
So I mean it's handy to have the prospective love interest right there in plain sight. And I suppose it solves some timeline issues too. But I think it's more about raising the stakes, right? In other words, it's not just that her father is not letting her live in the style to which she believes she should, or that she's facing the rest of her life living with her stepmother. It's that her uncle wants her committed because she's epileptic. Her father's going to throw her out because she's having an affair with Bridget Sullivan. So it really raises the stakes. In a way. I mean, that suggests that we just don't think it's dramatic enough.
Yeah. Well, I can say this is very dramatic. It's backwards here. But The Trial of Lizzie Borden by Cara Robertson. It is a very dramatic, page-turning read. And I learned so much from it. And thank you so much, Cara, for writing this and for coming on to talk about it.
Well, thank you. It was a real treat.
That's so great.
Yeah, thanks again. And we will see you all in a few weeks as we reassess the future of this podcast. We're going to have a new relaunch in a few weeks, so we're very excited to keep you informed of that. And Cara, thanks again for joining us. I just want to add how I'm always amazed when you find books, especially historical nonfiction books, about things that we know already, but still somehow the author has the ability to turn into a page turner, which that's a true art. So thank you. All right, everyone, until next time, thanks again. We are Esoterica.